My name is Sophia Reynolds. I am 31 years old, and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. What should have been the happiest day of my life turned into a power game I never agreed to play. But one move from me changed everything. What would you do if, on your wedding day, your own parents looked you in the eye and said, "Follow our rules or pay for everything yourself"? Would you fold under pressure just to keep the peace? Or would you stand there in your wedding dress and let them underestimate you? Now imagine this. While they thought they controlled the money, the invites, the power, they had no idea who was actually coming to the wedding. And what happens when those guests sit down, look around, and realize this wedding isn't just about love, but leverage? Stay till the end, because pride is expensive. They didn't raise their voices. That's the part that still gets me. It was the morning of my wedding. The sun was coming through the window, my dress hanging behind me, makeup half done, phone buzzing with congratulations. This was supposed to be the day I felt safe, celebrated, surrounded by love. Instead, my parents asked to speak to me privately. And when parents say that, you already know nothing good ever follows. We sat down, no hugs, no smiles, just that look. The one that says, "We're not asking." My mother folded her hands like she was about to pray. My father cleared his throat, the same way he did before making decisions that were already final. That's when they said it. "Sophia, we need you to understand something," my father began. "This wedding reflects on us," my mother added quickly. "And because we're paying," he continued, "we expect you to follow our rules." Rules, not suggestions, not advice, rules. They wanted control over the ceremony, the seating, the speeches, the traditions. Who could attend? Who couldn't? They even had opinions about my husband's family, where they'd sit, how visible they'd be, how much space they were allowed to take. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "If you don't agree," my mother said calmly, "you can pay for the wedding yourself." No anger, no emotion, just an ultimatum dressed up as responsibility, as if love had terms and conditions. As if support could be withdrawn like a credit card, I remember looking at my hands. My nails were done perfectly, pale pink, steady. On the outside, I looked calm. On the inside, something cracked. Because here's what they didn't understand. This wasn't about money. This was about power. They weren't helping me. They were owning me. They weren't supporting my marriage. They were staging a performance, and I was the prop. And the timing, that was the cruelest part. They waited until the wedding day, until emotions were high, until guests were flying in. Until walking away would look dramatic, ungrateful, embarrassing. They knew what they were doing. I thought about all the years before this moment, the achievements that were never enough. The praise that always came with conditions, the way love in my family was earned, not given, and suddenly everything made sense. This wedding wasn't a gift, it was leverage. My mother leaned closer and said, "We just want what's best for you." That phrase, the most dangerous sentence parents can use, because what's best usually means what makes them comfortable. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say, "This is my day." I wanted to remind them that marriage is about partnership, not permission. But I didn't. I smiled. I nodded. And I said, "Okay." You should have seen the relief on their faces. They thought they'd won. They thought fear worked. They thought money still controlled me. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that this ultimatum had just exposed their biggest weakness. They assumed I couldn't afford independence. They assumed I needed them. They assumed silence meant surrender. But silence, when chosen carefully, is strategy. As they stood up, already discussing last-minute changes, already rearranging my life like furniture, I sat there realizing something powerful. They didn't ask who else was involved in this wedding. They didn't ask who supported me. They didn't ask who respected me. They never asked because they never thought they had to. And that's the danger of ultimatums. When you give someone only two choices, you never consider the third, the one where they let you believe you're in control, while they prepare the moment you lose it. That morning, in my wedding dress, I made a quiet decision. I would give them exactly what they asked for, compliance, right up until the moment it cost them everything. If you've ever read real revenge stories, you know this rule. The The moment you argue, you lose leverage. So I didn't argue. When my parents laid down their ultimatum, I nodded like a compliant daughter. No raised voice, no tears, no speeches about independence or boundaries. I didn't even hesitate. I just said, okay, if that's what you want. That single word changed the entire dynamic. You could feel the shift in the room. The tension disappeared. Their shoulders relaxed. My mother smiled like she just prevented a disaster. My father stood taller, already mentally checking off tasks like a project manager who'd regained control. That's the thing about people who love power. They mistake silence for surrender. From that moment on, they treated the wedding like a corporate acquisition they'd successfully closed. Meetings replaced conversations. Instructions replaced requests. They didn't ask what I wanted anymore, they informed me. And I let them. Because while they were busy managing aesthetics and appearances, I was doing something far more important. I was watching. I watched who they felt comfortable disrespecting. I watched how they spoke when they thought authority was unquestioned. I watched how quickly "we're doing this for you" turned into "this is how it's going to be." They assumed I was stressed, emotional, distracted by wedding chaos. That assumption worked in my favor. When people think you're overwhelmed, they stop guarding themselves. I let my parents believe the money was the leash. Behind the scenes, I made no effort to correct them. When my mother said, "Remember, we're paying, so this is non-negotiable," I simply replied, "I understand." When my father reminded me who was handling the guest list, I thanked him. Gratitude disarms people. What they didn't know, and what I didn't correct, was that I'd already secured my own financial safety net months ago. I had savings, I had support, I had options. But options are useless if revealed too early. So I let them manage vendors. I let them rearrange seating. I let them think the entire event stood on their approval. Meanwhile, I quietly handled the one thing they underestimated: relationships, not emotional ones, professional ones. See, my parents' world revolved around status, but only within their bubble. Same circles, same faces, same limited influence. They believed money equaled power because that's how it had always worked for them. They never once asked who I worked with. They never asked who respected me in my industry. They never asked who had my back without conditions. They didn't ask because people who rely on control rarely imagine someone else building power differently. I added names to the guest list slowly, carefully. People who mattered, but not in obvious ways: executives, investors, senior partners, individuals who didn't flaunt wealth but moved it, people who knew my work, not my parents' reputation. I didn't announce it. I didn't make a show of it. I just forwarded updated lists and waited for approval that never came, because my parents trusted that I wouldn't dare challenge them. And that was their mistake. On the surface, I was obedient. Underneath, I was positioning. Every yes I gave them bought me time. Every smile lowered their guard. Every assumption they made widened the gap between perception and reality. Revenge doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like cooperation. They thought they were in control because they never saw resistance. They never considered that compliance could be strategic. They never imagined that someone raised under pressure would learn how to operate within it. By the time the wedding week arrived, my parents were confident, almost smug. They spoke about how well this turned out. They congratulated themselves on maintaining tradition, appearances, and authority. They had no idea the room they were about to walk into didn't belong to them anymore. And that's the quiet power of letting people believe they're winning. Because when they finally realize they are, it's already too late to stop it. If there's one thing people in power hate doing, it's double-checking the details they think they already control. My parents believed the guest list was theirs. In their minds, it was locked, approved, finalized, unquestionable. They trusted that because they were paying, nothing could happen without their signature. That assumption gave me space, a lot of space. I didn't overhaul the list. That would have been obvious. I didn't challenge names. I didn't remove anyone important to them. I made small additions, quiet ones, names that didn't ring alarm bells. Names that looked ordinary if you didn't know how to read them. Because the truth is, influence rarely announces itself. I added people my parents would have dismissed as work contacts, former colleagues, industry peers, executives who didn't use flashy titles in social settings. People whose power didn't come from noise but from access, and I did it slowly, one name at a time, spread across weeks, buried between cousins, family friends, and plus ones. When the updated lists were sent to vendors, my parents skimmed them the way confident managers skim reports they assume will confirm what they already believe. No questions, no follow-ups. No curiosity. That's what arrogance does. It convinces you there's nothing left to learn. What they didn't realize was that this wedding wasn't just a ceremony. It was a room, and rooms matter. Who's in them? Who's watching? Who's talking when you're not listening? Every person I added had a reason for being there. Some had worked with me directly. They knew my competence, my discipline, my ethics. Others knew my reputation secondhand, but that was enough. A few had crossed paths with my parents professionally in the past and hadn't forgotten it. I wasn't inviting allies for protection. I was inviting witnesses, people who understood power dynamics. People who noticed who hosted, who deferred, who assumed authority. People who could read the room in 5 minutes and understand exactly who held real influence and who was pretending. What made it work was subtlety. I didn't seat them together, I didn't introduce them loudly, I didn't draw attention. They arrived like any other guests, well-dressed, polite, calm. But once seated, conversations started flowing sideways instead of forward. People recognized each other, old connections resurfaced, quiet nods were exchanged. That's when the shift began. My parents were too busy greeting their social circle to notice. They were performing, shaking hands, accepting compliments, playing hosts. They didn't realize the real networking had already started. Because in corporate spaces, introductions don't always begin with names. They begin with shared experiences, shared projects, shared knowledge. And suddenly, people who hadn't spoken in years were reconnecting, right there, under my parents' roof. And the most ironic part, none of it violated their rules. They said nothing about who could be invited, as long as appearances were maintained. They never asked for backgrounds. They never asked how people knew me. They assumed relevance flowed upward through them. They never imagined relevance could flow around them. By the time dinner was served, the room had changed. Conversations deepened. Laughter softened. Attention shifted. My parents were still central, but no longer essential. That's when I knew the list had done its job, because the most effective revenge isn't humiliation, it's repositioning. I didn't need to expose them. I didn't need to confront them. I just needed the right people to see the full picture, unfiltered. And when influential people see the truth on their own, you don't have to explain anything. They connect the dots for you, all because of a guest list no one thought to check. Power doesn't shift loudly, it shifts quietly, then all at once. The ceremony itself went exactly how my parents planned, perfect timing, perfect seating, perfect optics. From the outside, it looked like they'd executed a flawless event. They stood tall, confident, playing their roles like seasoned executives closing a public deal. And that's why they didn't see it coming. The moment wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no announcement, just a subtle change in gravity. It started during the reception. I noticed it before they did. People they didn't recognize, people they'd assumed were distant connections, weren't staying in their assigned seats. They were moving, leaning in, crossing the room. Conversations were forming in clusters that hadn't existed an hour earlier. My parents were still greeting guests like hosts who believed the room belonged to them. But something was off. Handshakes lingered longer. Smiles became more measured. Compliments shifted from social to professional. I watched my father approach a group, confident, familiar smile ready. He introduced himself the way he always did, position first, name second. It had worked his entire life. This time the response was polite and non-committal. No deference, no enthusiasm. Just acknowledgement, then something small but fatal happened. Someone mentioned my work, not casually, not vaguely, specifically, a project, a result. A decision I'd made that saved time, money, or risk. That's when the dynamic changed, because suddenly I wasn't just the bride. I was a professional peer. I saw my mother's expression tighten when a guest turned to me instead of her during a conversation. I saw my father hesitate, just for a second, before realizing he wasn't the center of this exchange. That hesitation, that's when power leaks out. More moments followed. A board member asked me a question. An investor congratulated me, not my parents. A senior executive referenced a conversation they'd had with me months earlier. My parents were still in the room. They just weren't controlling it anymore. And here's the part they truly weren't prepared for. People started comparing notes. Quietly, respectfully, but unmistakably, stories overlapped, names were recognized, context was filled in. And slowly, the narrative my parents relied on, the one where they were the authority, the gatekeepers, the source, began to dissolve. No one challenged them directly. They were simply bypassed. In corporate environments, that's the most dangerous thing that can happen to someone who thrives on hierarchy. Because when people stop going through you, you're already irrelevant. I caught my father watching a conversation from across the room. He wasn't part of it. He wasn't invited in. And for the first time, he looked uncertain, not angry, not defensive, just unsure of where he stood. My mother tried to regain control by redirecting attention. More hosting, more smiles. More introductions, but the room had recalibrated. The center had shifted, toward competence, toward credibility, toward me, and I didn't have to say a word. That's the thing about real leverage. It doesn't need defending. By the time dinner ended, my parents had realized something fundamental had changed, even if they couldn't articulate it. The authority they assumed was automatic they were still respected, they just weren't dominant, and dominance is addictive. Once it slips, you feel it immediately. As I stood there, newly married, calm, observant, I understood the full scope of what had happened. They thought this wedding was their stage. They thought money bought control. They thought ultimatums worked forever. But rooms don't belong to the loudest person. They belong to the most relevant one. And in that moment, without confrontation, without cruelty, without explanation, the balance tipped. Not against them, just away from them. The most satisfying part of revenge isn't the moment people realize they were wrong. It's the moment they realize nothing can be undone. After the wedding, life didn't explode. There were no dramatic phone calls, no angry confrontations, no apologies either. On the surface, everything returned to normal, which is usually the first sign that something is. My parents assumed the tension would fade, that the wedding had been a social success, that whatever strange energy they'd felt was temporary. They went back to their routines believing authority, once challenged, naturally reasserts itself. That's not how corporate reality works, because power doesn't reset, it reassigns. The first shift showed up quietly, a meeting my father expected to attend, suddenly optional, a conversation my mother was usually looped into, handled elsewhere. Calls that used to be returned within hours. Took days. No one announced a change. No one explained anything. That's the beauty and the cruelty of professional consequences. They don't arrive as punishment, they arrive as indifference. Meanwhile, my world kept moving forward. People followed up with me, not urgently, not desperately, just naturally. Emails, introductions. Casual check-ins that carried weight. Nothing inappropriate, nothing aggressive, just recognition settling into place. And recognition is dangerous when you've built your identity on being indispensable. My parents noticed, but couldn't pinpoint why. They'd ask vague questions. Have you heard from so-and-so lately? Do you know what's happening with that project? I always answered honestly. Sometimes I didn't know, sometimes I did. Either way, they weren't the center anymore. What made it irreversible was that no lines had been crossed, no insults were exchanged, no bridges burned. From the outside, it looked like nothing had happened at all. That's why they couldn't fight it. You can argue against accusations. You can defend against attacks. You can't argue against silence. Because silence means the decision has already been made. At one point, my father tried to reassert control the only way he knew how, through authority. He pushed harder, became more direct. More demanding, it didn't work. People responded politely, professionally, and then moved on. That's when I realized the revenge was complete. Not because they were suffering, but because they were no longer steering. And the irony, they had given me the blueprint themselves. Years earlier, they taught me that money equals power, appearances matter, and control is everything. What they never considered was what happens when someone learns the rules better than they did and stops playing for approval. I never confronted them about the ultimatum. I never brought up the wedding again. I never needed to. Because every time they watched influence slip just a little further out of reach, they remembered the moment they tried to tighten their grip. And found nothing there. The final realization came much later. My mother said it casually one day, not accusing, just confused. "You've changed," she said. She was right. Not because I'd become harder, but because I'd stopped negotiating my worth. The silent corporate revenge wasn't about punishing them. It was about removing myself from a system where love was conditional and power was borrowed. They didn't lose everything. They just lost the advantage they assumed was permanent. And in corporate terms, that's worse. Because when people realize you're no longer necessary, they don't attack you. They don't undermine you. They don't even resent you. They replace you, quietly. Efficiently, permanently, and all of it traced back to one mistake made on my wedding day, thinking an ultimatum was strength, when in reality it was an invitation to walk away, to build elsewhere, and to let the consequences speak for themselves. If this story made you feel something, pause for a second. Think about the people who tried to control your choices, your money, or your future. If you believe respect should never come with conditions, hit the like button. It tells this story to reach others who need to hear it. Subscribe for more real, powerful stories where silence speaks louder than arguments and revenge doesn't scream. It wins. And comment below, what would you have done in my place? Walk away quietly or confront them directly? Your story might be the next one told.